Now, we're about midway along the line. Don't think of these earthworks as being in a straight line. They actually zigzagged because you want to be able to provide enfilade fire. You cannot do that if it's just a straight line from point A to point B. And as it turns out, there would be layers or tiers of lines. So we're kind of at ground level, and at the top of the ridge, there's another line of works that would have provided covering fire for this line down here. But after 160 years, they're in remarkably good condition. We're standing on top of the earthworks that are belonged under private ownership, and this area may be developed one day. But look how the Confederate soldiers who were stationed here built these fingers or traverses off the back of the lines to build probably shelters. So you've got a line there, a line here, a line here. Look how deep they are. And what they probably did is they took pine logs and laid them over the top. And at the very end, up against the works, they would have built a little chimney, and that's where they could have provided fire and for cooking. So in your mind's eye, you can imagine just these guys building these things sort of slanted down to the back of the works, provided this little bomb-proof shelter, and that's how they lived in January and February, which is a very cold and very wet period. Confederate soldiers commented on how miserable that winter was. So after all these years, you can still see these little structures that they built.
No vegetation was here at the time?
No vegetation, no. Whatever vegetation would have been surrounding the works, they would have taken down to use for heating and cooking. Because there were 4,500 soldiers stretched out along this line. One brigade, Johnson and Hager's brigade, sent over to Fort Anderson to reinforce that garrison. And then Hoke, whose field headquarters were at Sugar Loaf, but we don't know exactly where. So he would have been here in the field with the troops. Bragg kind of came and went. But on February the 10th, the day before the Federals launched the opening battle of the Wilmington Campaign, the Battle of Sugar Loaf, Braxton Bragg got on a train in Wilmington and returned to Richmond, where he had been summoned to reorganize his military staff. But it showed his indifference to Wilmington's fate. The same place that Robert E. Lee said, if it fell, he could not maintain his army.
How did he get a fort named after him?
Well, it's soon to be changed. Yeah.
It was a joke.
Those forts, the vast majority of those forts were not named for Confederate generals. They were named for them as United States Army officers who later became Confederate generals. So Braxton Bragg, Captain Braxton Bragg, that's who that fort was named for, not Confederate General Braxton Bragg. U.S. Army Captain Braxton Bragg, who was, quite the hero from the Mexican War. One of them. Another one being Jefferson Davis.
And Robert E. Lee.
And Robert E. Lee. Yeah. And U.S. Grant. James Longstreet. George Thomas. We go on and on. All right, well, let's go up the ridge. And what we're going to do is walk to Sugarloaf. I'll stop periodically and talk.
Papers. He went to Carolina. He went to Carolina, and his papers were all in the University of Chapel Hill. I put all. Yeah.
These works in here are very subtle, and you could easily just walk up this ridge and not notice that this is the ditch. The ditch is where they excavated the sand for the earthworks. So in '64 there would have been African American laborers, Confederate soldiers, shovels and picks, standing where you are, throwing the dirt to the backside to build the field work. And then soldiers and laborers on the inside digging the trench where they would be deployed during combat. And so they'd be digging, throwing the dirt to the front side to help build the rampart, the field works, and then they would revet the line on the inside to prevent erosion into the trench. Okay, and then they lived out there. Some lived up against the earthworks, but others just lived out in that sand plain, if you can imagine that. Now they were here for about 6 weeks in the winter of '65, most of them. And they talked about how remote everything was. Nothing nearby, no people, no little farmhouses. It was pretty desolate and pretty lonely, pretty miserable. Cold, rainy, I can't imagine. Just a different breed of people in those days for sure. And then of course, on a regular basis, they would have been shelled by the Union warships on the Cape Fear River and on the ocean side, and then would have to contend with the Union troops now about 800 yards to the south, firing on them too. So you had to be careful. You couldn't get up on top of the earthworks and do a song and dance. Snipers would have picked you off. So it was trench warfare. That was it. By '64, both sides had gone into trench warfare for the most part. So a pretty miserable existence on the Confederate soldiers' part. And the thing that they talked about the most was the sand. They said it was just inescapable. It got into everything. It got into your hair, got into your eyes, into your ears, into your clothes, into your blanket roll, into your food. That's what they complained about the most. And they were so bored that they invented games like betting games like who could get the closest to an incoming shell when it exploded without being killed. All right, I'm gonna put $5 down on me. I can get within 10 yards of that thing without being killed. Seriously, that's what they would do. So they would run toward the incoming shells, hope that they didn't get killed, and then they would look for the brass fuses that they would make into jewelry and ornaments. Got a great description of Confederate soldiers. Said, yeah, this was the games that we played, the kind of things that we did. We were so bored. That's being pretty bored. We don't know the number of casualties. Unfortunately, those records were destroyed. So we don't know a lot of details. Some letters of Confederate soldiers who were stationed here have survived, and they all basically say pretty much the same thing, that it was a pretty miserable existence. We felt like we sat on our muskets, that we could have done a lot more to help support Fort Fisher. And the only thing that we had between us and the Union brigades that were attacking the fort were United States colored troops. Of course, the Confederates would have used a different term, and they considered them not just inferior people, but inferior fighters. And the comments would be, yeah, our commanders, meaning Bragg and Hoke, would not allow us to attack, and the only thing that we have between us and the force that are attacking Fort Fisher are these black guys. We could have taken them easily. So you see some of those kinds of comments. But in fact, those African Americans were very good combatants. These were early war units like the 1st and the 10th and the 27th and the 37th. These were top-notch, hardened veterans. They were no pushover, and they turned out to be really, really good fighters, as even the Confederate soldiers would later concede. So that's the situation here.
There are records of a lot of sickness among the Confederate troops. stationed out here during that period?
No, just because the documentation just isn't there. Again, the letters that I have looked at over the decades reveal pretty much what I said about their condition, but not a whole lot about sickness. Now, it was winter, so some of the diseases that they would have dealt with, agues and fevers, during the summer weren't there. But yeah, no, dysentery, the big killer of all soldiers. 2/3 of all Civil War soldiers died of sickness, camp diseases, and not bullets or cannonball fragments. They did not die in combat. And dysentery was the big killer.
When the major battle of Fort Fisher takes place, there's 3,200 troops up here that were just listening to all that going on, but not doing it. They were not sent out by Bragg to go down and okay. I just want to make sure I have that.
Some great observations that I'll meld into an answer. Robert F. Hoke, who by the way looked like a young Robert E. Lee. He really did. He is field commander after the departure of Bragg on February the 10th. Command of the Confederate forces devolves to him. He could only do, prior to that, what Bragg instructed him to do. And so he did not support or attack the rear of the Union Army that was attacking Fort Fisher because Bragg told him not to. Now Hoke can use his own judgment as to strategy and tactics and so forth. And he was not as aggressive as Hoke generally was during the war. And the question is why? A couple of things. Number one, he was ill that winter. He was sick. He still remained in command, but he was not feeling very good. But I think the other thing is that his division had been absolutely pummeled at the Battle of Fort Harrison back in September of '64. And that was by destructive naval fire. So he knew how lethal those warships could be. And I think he was just a little gun shy, pun intended, of deploying his troops to make an attack on the Union troops that were dug in between here and Fort Fisher because of the warships on the water side, on the ocean side during the Fort Fisher attacks, but then also on the river side after the fall of Fort Fisher. And I think he was just a little gun shy about getting his troops out there because they had been so badly damaged at Fort Harrison in '64. And then after the war, we don't know his state of mind or why he decided to do what he did, because after the war, he refused to write about it and he refused to talk about it. When the war ended, it ended for Robert F. Hoke. Yeah. The peninsula from here, from the river to the ocean, is about 1.5 miles wide, where we are. Those warships were capable of firing shells with accuracy 2.5 miles. So they could have hit easily from the ocean side or the river side.
The Confederate batteries that would fire toward the ships,
yes.
Did they have enough range to reach the ships where the ship could be beyond the range of the Confederate cannons?
Okay,
they could lob over.
Those warships were firing 9-inch, 11-inch Dahlgren shells, meaning 9-inch, 11-inch spherical balls. They were firing 20-pounder, 30-pounder parrot shells, cylindrical projectiles. So they had the distance, they had the accuracy, they had the experience. The Confederates on that end, those light artillery pieces, and I can't remember specifically what Andrew Paris had, but they were 6-pounder and 12-pounder cannons. You're not going to do a lot of damage against a warship with a light artillery piece like that. Now, on Sugarloaf itself, where we're going to go, on the summit was the Wilmington Horse Artillery, part of the 10th North Carolina Light Artillery Battalion. And they had 12-pounders, 12-pounder howitzers that could do some damage against the lighter warships on the Cape River. Now, at one point, at Fort Fisher, there were Whitworth rifles, cannons, 12-pounders that could hit a fly off a post at 5 miles. They were deadly accurate, and they did a lot of damage to the ships. We're just going to walk along the earthworks. You can see where they are. We're just on the rear of these earthworks. So we've got the ditch on the front side there. So we're just going to walk along the works. I'll stop a couple more times before we get down to the other fight here. Earthworks right here. Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay.
There's nothing having been done to it.
Yeah.
Again, I'm walking us along the line of the earthworks. So there are places where they're in really good state of preservation, and you're actually walking in the trench at the back of the earthworks. Okay, so we're just going to continue our walk along the earthworks themselves. Just wanted to point out, see how the works turn here, almost a 90-degree turn. And we're now entering state property. All of that is privately owned property. I hope that the works will be preserved because the gentlemen who own the property are from Carolina Beach, and they know about them and they know of the historical significance. But this area may be developed. We'll wait and see. Generally, everything on the west side of the Dow Road is in the easement for Sunny Point, and they're very particular about the development of the area because it's in the blast zone.
Is this in the blast zone here?
Yeah, technically it's in the blast zone. Yeah. Okay. This is the best one. Yeah, y'all were standing on top of the field. Look how much larger and broader they are here than they were where we started at Park. So this is one of the most nicely preserved sections of the line. You can see how deep the trench was here. Even today, 160 years later, you're looking northward toward the lines. It's unlikely that you'd be able to see me because I'm on the 511 in the bottom of the trench. And then during the fighting, Confederate soldiers would load their rifle muskets down here out of sight. And then they would step up. You can almost see where the firing platform or the step was, or the banquet. And they could have stepped up and then fired over the parapet or the crest of the works, the head logs, and then step back down and reloaded. Of course, they're using, for the most part, single shot rifle muskets, and you can get off about 3 shots a minute, but you want to be able to load your rifle without being shot. So love this little section of the works. Now we're entering state property. Okay. Oh, by the way, it's 11 o'clock. I guess that's the end of the tour.
Good luck getting back.
Good luck getting back.
Some bars.
Well, just look how nice the works are in here. Where the works were exposed, the elements have pretty much destroyed them. Some off-road vehicle traffic back in the 50s and 60s and 70s did some damage. You can't do that in the park anymore. But in the woods, they're just in a remarkable state of preservation after all these years. So you see this segment right here. We'll get ready to walk. We're continuing to climb. And then we'll make our way to Sugarloaf. Okay? Does anybody have any questions? Okay, so we're on the inside of the works. We're on the north side of the works where the Confederate soldiers would have been. So in your mind's eye, you can just imagine hundreds of armed Confederate soldiers within your sight.
They'd be facing this way.
And they're facing this way.
Fort Fisher.
Right. So we're on the north side, and the Federals are about 800 yards on the south side. All that ground is cleared off for field of fire, and they're trading shots with each other on a regular basis. And the big push on February 11th, along the entire line, the Federals attack, but without success. They're not able to overrun the works. I mean, these are really strong works. And generally, you've got to have 3-to-1 odds for having any kind of chance of overrunning a defensive work like this. So if you pull out your map, it's not going to show it specifically on the map of the Battle of Sugar Loaf. Look at that engagement map. So that massive frontal assault along the entire line, U.S. colored troops are leading the Union attack. They fail to overrun the works. They withdraw about 800 yards. They dig their own line of earthworks, which survived until the 1980s. And then the Corps of Engineers destroyed them. Seriously.
Fort Anderson.
Jeez.
Oh, that's right, 11 o'clock. He told me they were going to fire the cannon. So on 2 nights, February 12th, and then again on the 14th, the commander of U.S. Army Forces, a guy named John Schofield, General John Schofield, sent a party of troops up the Masonboro Island, what we would call the Masonboro Island area. There was no island there, but you see that finger of land where Battery Gatlin is, and that continued all the way to Wrightsville Beach. Now you've got the Carolina Beach Canal that cuts it, but in those days it ran continuously all the way to Wrightsville Beach. And so they tried to go up that peninsula and then cross the Sound using pontoon bridges to get on the rear or on the north side of these works to attack them from above. They even sent warships up to unload the pontoons, but bad weather on both nights killed that operation. And they had to withdraw into their lines. And now, okay, how are we going to capture Wilmington? How are we going to get upriver? These works at Sugarloaf are too strong. And so what they did is they transferred one division of reinforcements over to Smithville, modern Southport, to march up the mainland to attack Fort Anderson. And that's what happened with these works. We'll hold that story until we get to Sugarloaf. But these works are considered too strong to overrun by frontal assault. It's going to be too bloody. They'd already been badly battered and bloodied in the attack on Fort Fisher, and they don't want to incur more casualties than they already had.
Who made that decision, Chris? Was it Schofield? Or
It was
Ames?
Schofield who made that decision. Right. Now it's General Terry, Alfred Terry's corps. He had commanded the troops that captured Fort Fisher, and he's still in command of his expeditionary corps. It's called Terry's Provisional Corps. But Schofield is the overall commander because he has the rank as senior officer. So he will make that decision. Right? But he consults with Terry. He keeps Terry in the loop. It's not a totally unilateral decision, but just based on what the Union forces that have made reconnaissances in force against Sugarloaf, and now the all-out assault on Sugarloaf, it's just, this is going to be bloody. Let's figure out a different way to capture Wilmington. And U.S. Grant has already come down earlier. He had been here on the night of the 28th for several hours. You can imagine he left his field headquarters at City Point, Virginia, came down the coast to consult with Admiral Porter, General Terry about the best way to capture Wilmington. And holding a war council on Porter's flagship, the Malvern, they decided to attack Fort Anderson on the mainland. That was the best way because the mainland would provide Union troops a lot more elbow room to operate than narrow Federal Point. Their movements are constricted over here because the peninsula is comparatively so narrow. But on the mainland, gives them lots of room to operate. So that's what they decided before reinforcements arrived. But Schofield still made the decision. No, you know what? Let's just attack Sugarloaf, see if we can overrun it, and then just move straight on Wilmington without having to transfer an entire division of troops to the other side of the river. Let's try that. And when that didn't work, the movement up the Masonboro Peninsula, that didn't work. And he finally conceded, okay, we're going to capture Wilmington by attacking Fort Anderson first.
Did Grant bring Schofield in from the west? Was he out in the west before this?
He'd been in the battles at Nashville,
Franklin,
and Franklin, right? And then Grant had his entire corps, the 23rd Army Corps, transferred from the west to Alexandria, Virginia, with the idea of sending that corps to Sherman if Sherman got into trouble in Georgia. But Sherman captured Savannah.
Yeah.
And then, of course, as I said, Grant wants to transfer his legion to Virginia, but instead decides to bring Schofield's corps down the coast to reinforce Sherman and give him 80,000 men. But finally decided, no, let's send them to Wilmington. Let's capture Wilmington, which will, I think, better assure the success of Sherman's Carolinas campaign. And it did.
Ended up in his corps plus others at Wise Fork.
That's right.
And went up to Goldsboro eventually.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's walk onto the hill. We're getting higher and higher. You didn't even have to take a drink to do it.
Schofield, yeah, he was not up there.
This is one of the highest points in New Hanover County. We're almost 50 feet high.
And that's a natural
So that's a mountain in this area.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. Okay, next stop, Sugarloaf. All right. We are standing on top of Sugarloaf Hill. So named by the colonial residents of Brunswick, or Brunswick Town as locals call it, directly across the Cape Fear River. It's 1.25 miles from here to there, which is about the distance that we have walked since we left the cars. Brunswick Town was the first enduring settlement on the Cape Fear River. Founded in 1726, it was basically destroyed as a result of the Revolutionary War. We had a hurricane in 1761 that carved New Inlet, but also did a lot of damage to Brunswick Town. Another storm in 1769 was the Fran and Florence of its day. and did a lot of damage to Brunswicktown. And then the Revolutionary War. Reportedly, the British destroyed a portion of Brunswicktown in 1776. So it never recovered from the Revolutionary War. And then you had another rival community 14 miles further upriver that thrived. People who had lived at Brunswicktown and worked at Brunswicktown moved up to the new community, originally called New Carthage, then New Liverpool, then the New Town or Newton, and by 1739 Wilmington. So Wilmington thrived and Brunswicktown faded into oblivion. But it was built there for a reason. Deep water point, nice bluffs where you could build a town, and the Confederate engineers in 1862 saw the same advantages for building a fortification. You had a deep water point where larger draft vessels could stop, and you had nice bluffs to build a battery. And that battery eventually turned into a much larger earthen fortification built along the same character as Fort Fisher. And unlike Fort Fisher, only about 25% of the fort remains. About 90% of Fort Anderson is still there. And of course, it is now part of the Brunswicktown Fort Anderson State Historic Site. So directly across the river. The colonials called it Sugarloaf because as the sun set behind them to the west and shone off the west side of the hill, it looked like a loaf of sugar. Of course, we'd have a bag of sugar, but they called it the Sugarloaf. It's not the only sugarloaf in the world. There are a lot of sugarloaves, but that's how it got its name. And during the war, because it was directly across from Fort Anderson, it made for a nice mutually supportive defensive position. And if you look at your sketch map, that Confederate soldier made of the Sugarloaf lines, again, the only known wartime view of the Sugarloaf line. On the far right side, you see Sugarloaf. And on top it says Sutherland. Sutherland's Battery. That's Thomas J. Sutherland's battery, known as the Wilmington Horse Artillery. So they were stationed on top, on the summit of Sugarloaf Hills where we are standing. They had a nice range of fire downriver. Now there wasn't a whole lot of damage, comparatively speaking, that 12-pounder howitzers and 6-pounder guns, ordnance rifles could make against the warships. But they were here, and one of the crewmen was Corporal Hosey Lewis Horne, who was originally from Onslow County but grew up in New Hanover County. His family owned property in the area today known as Monkey Junction. The Horne home was right on the side of the Federal Point Road, which was the Carolina Beach Road of its day. Came out of Wilmington at 12th Street and then went down the peninsula across where the hospital is today, where the Cameron Art Museum is, Halliburton Park, down South College Road to Monkey Junction, and then weaved in and out of the Carolina Beach Road today. But the Horne family home was right on the side of the road, just east of the Monkey Junction area. And Hosey Lewis Horne served in the Wilmington Horse Artillery. But his brother Jacob, in 1863, joined the 2nd North Carolina Union Volunteer Infantry in Newbern. And in 1980, jump up to 1980, I'd gone into Will Reeder's florist to buy some flowers for a girlfriend, who Joe was not Nancy. I have to be careful telling this story, because the girl I was buying the flowers for was pre-Nancy. But I was a romantic kind of a guy, so I was buying flowers. And the guy who waited on me was a gentleman named Robert C. Horne. At the time, I was the last curator of the Blockade Runner Museum, and somehow Mr. Horne and I fell into a conversation about local history. And he said, Chris, my grandfather, his name was Joseph Lewis Horne, fought against his brother at Fort Fisher. Man, that's a great story. He said, well, I've got a photograph of my grandfather in Confederate uniform, and you're welcome to a copy. And sure enough, he gave me a copy of the photograph, but I just had the family story. These two brothers fought against each other at Fort Fisher. Under what circumstances? And when I was working on my master's thesis at East Carolina, and I was going through some microfilm looking at newspapers, long before there was, online services like newspapers.com. I'm going through old newspapers, and I ran across a Philadelphia Inquirer newspaper article from February the 27th, 1865. The armies and the navies had embedded reporters, as we do today, and they would usually on a weekly basis send reports of ongoing military operations, either from the Union Army's perspective, the Union Navy's perspective, and they would be published in their respective newspapers. So I'm looking at the Philadelphia Inquirer newspaper, February 27th, and there's this long report about ongoing operations for the Wilmington Campaign. And in that is a titled excerpt, an incident. And the reporter said that when the Union Army got halfway between Sugarloaf and Wilmington, it stopped in the road to rest. And a young officer asked permission to step out of line and visit a house by the roadside. His commanding officer asked him, "What business do you have at that house?" He said, "It is the home of my boyhood and the residence of my parents." Soon the boy was clasped in the arms of his overjoyed mother, the reporter wrote. "Your brother was here yesterday to say goodbye as the Confederate Army marched past here. That mother has a son in both armies." And to me, that confirmed or gave a lot of credence to Mr. Horne's family story, that oral tradition. Because on February the 19th, after the abandonment of the Sugarloaf lines, Joseph Lewis Horne, member of the Wilmington Horse Artillery, would have stopped to say goodbye as the Army retreated towards Wilmington. And the next day, as the Union Army is pursuing the retreating Confederate Army toward Wilmington, it would have made perfect sense that Jacob Horne, who was serving as a guide with Terry's Provisional Corps, to stop and say hello to his family, who probably had not seen in a couple of years. That mother has a son in both armies. So it was literally a brother against brother war, and we have an example of that in the Wilmington Campaign. And I'll talk about this in my presentation tomorrow at the Cameron Art Museum, but both of those boys survived the war. Both of them returned to New Hanover County to live out their lives as farmers, and I wondered what their relationship was like. And depending who I've asked over the decades that I've had this story, they either got along great or they never spoke to each other again for the rest of their lives. And I think the truth is probably somewhere in between. That the sense of betrayal that the Union brother had made in joining the Union Army festered with his brother and maybe with other members of his family. That was an act of betrayal against the South. And now he's returned home, the prodigal son. And but I think eventually during holidays, maybe birthdays, they got together. Eventually passions cooled as time passed, and they reconciled. just as the nation did. A perfect example of that. The nation eventually reconciled. It took some time, and we're still fighting some battles, but I think that's a perfect encapsulation, a local encapsulation of what their family went through, what the communities would have gone through, what the states and what the nation would have gone through in the post-war years.
They had the order reunion. You know where they're buried at.
Yep, they're buried in the same cemetery, not side by side, but just off of Carolina Beach Road, Antoinette Drive, I think it's called. And in 2005, Russ, we had the family held a ceremony there to honor both brothers who've got new federally subsidized grave markers as veterans of.
I sent some kids out there a couple years ago to find them.
And they found.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's basically the end of the tour. Very quickly, just to summarize what happened, Schofield sent Jacob Cox's division to the west side of the Cape Fear River on February the 16th. So February 17th and 18th, his flotilla of warships, Admiral Porter's flotilla of warships, including the ironclad Montauk, would shell both Fort Anderson and Sugarloaf. Meanwhile, Cox's division would march from the south out of Smithville to attack Fort Anderson. Now overwhelmed by naval shells and a great number of Union troops, in excess of 6,000, General Johnson Haygood requested permission to evacuate Fort Anderson and retreat towards Wilmington. General Hoke, who was over here, hesitated because the abandonment of Fort Anderson would have necessitated the evacuation of Sugarloaf, because the Union warships, after capturing Fort Anderson, could have gone further up the Cape Fear River and could have shelled Sugarloaf from above or landed Marines to the north or transported some of Cox's corps from the west side of the river to the east side to attack Hoke from the north. So the abandonment of Fort Anderson necessitated Hoke to abandon the Sugarloaf lines in the early morning hours of February the 19th, 1865. And then Union troops would later that morning occupy these lines before picking up the pursuit of the retreating army on its way to Wilmington, and it would make one last stand at the Battle of Forks Road on February 20th and 21st. So between late December and late February, for about 2 months, Confederate forces were here along the Sugarloaf lines, and that's the role that Sugarloaf and its defenses played in the Wilmington Campaign. Now, if you want to, you can either go back the way we came, or what I would prefer to do is take you out in front of the earthworks and show you a line of Confederate, what we would call foxholes. They called them gopher holes in those days, rifle pits, where pickets or sentinels would have been stationed. And about 20 years ago, I was down here and with some students. I always brought my students down here every year, every semester. And I just thought, there had to have been an advanced line of works. You would have had a line of pickets that would have warned of an incoming assault. So if it was a nighttime assault, an early morning assault, these pickets would have been able to fire warning shots before they withdrew inside the main works. And so I thought, somewhere, if there's a ridge south of here, there's got to be a line of foxholes. I wonder if they still survive. And they did.
Wow.
And it's one of only, I brought Ed Bars, y'all all knew Ed Bars, the premier tour guide, American battlefields, and former chief historian of the National Park Service. He loved Wilmington. and I would always go along as his color commentator. I was his Bob Costas, and we did a number of Wilmington Campaign tours together. And I took him out and showed him this line, and he said, "Oh yeah." He said, "I've only seen them in one other place, in North Anna, Virginia." So these things are very, very rare. Y'all want to see them?
Yeah.
Okay, let's go do that. Directly across the river. Is that it right there? So you've got mutually supporting defensive positions. Okay, directly west. You see the Skull Island there? Okay? So directly on the other side of that Skull Island, you see where the bluffs are? Okay. The sun is actually shining on the high ground where the town would have been.
See the bulkhead over there?
It's, without binoculars, it's hard to see anything, but that's where it is.
Livermore.
Not the high ground to the south. That's hard to
The canal is right beside.
the way up to about where we are now. And then above that is the Brunswicktown Fort Anderson State Historic Site. And if you look carefully, you can see a fairly new house that was built at Kendall Plantation, which is part of the Orton Plantation property. And we're roughly a mile from the west side of the Cape Fear River here. But the federal government controls all of this property over here. And during states of emergency, they can and they have shut this place down. Carolina Beach State Park, Brunswicktown Fort Anderson State Historic Site, Fort Fisher, they control all of it. And as Russ said, if you want a good tour of Sunny Point, just take your motorboat over there and get too close.
It's real easy too.
Hey?
Way it's configured.
I was set up with the federal government. All we had to see
You know what I love about coming out here is the solitude. You can hear the wind blowing through the trees. Just the quiet. With a plane flying overhead. Maybe it's a Chinese balloon. So anyway, I'm out here with a small group of students, and I thought, let's just go south. Maybe there's a ridge south of where we are now. I've never been out here before. And let's just look and see if we can find some foxholes. And this was the first one I stumbled on. And this could be anything. It's a hole in the ground. It could be a stump hole for all I know. So this is the first one I discovered. I thought, okay, well, this makes some sense. They wouldn't have put them right at the very top of the ridge. They're more exposed to enemy forces, but they're also exposed to the elements. And remember, it's cold. It's wintertime, and they talk about how cold it is. So you build them just a little bit back. You can still see over the crest, but you're more protected from enemy gunfire and from the wind. So there's a hole in the ground. Interesting, all right? So, go on.
Where the road is.
Okay, so there's another hole in the ground. But again, it's just below the crest of the ridge, providing some security, and it's within whispering distance of the other hole. So if there's a soldier, or in some cases 2-man holes, they would have been able to communicate with each other. But that's just 2 holes in the ground. Well, when I wanted it.
Okay, now I'm getting kind of interested.
I told her that.
All right, by the time I got to the 5th hole, I am absolutely convinced. And this one's a nice deep one, maybe a 2-man hole. So I've got 5 within proximity. They're within distance that soldiers could have communicated easily enough with each other. So that's 5, and then there's number 6 right there. So by then, I'm absolutely convinced. Got him.
We got a lot of Confederate rifle pits. Here's number 6.
Now we've got 7.
Is this one right here, Chris?
Yeah, right there. Now we've got 7. This is the 7th one. I will say that these rifle pits, these gopher holes as they call them, foxholes, have never been excavated. And I talked with the archaeologist at Fort Fisher about doing that. There has to be some vestiges, there has to be some artifacts in the bottom of these rifle pits. Drop mini balls, percussion caps, uniform buttons. And I asked them about excavating them, and he said, oh man, that'd be virtually impossible. The property is owned by the federal government and managed on a daily basis by the state. So we would have to get permission from both the state and from the federal government to do this. And I can tell you right now, having been an archaeologist for so many decades, that would have required a lot more red tape and bureaucratic navigating than would be worth the effort to find maybe a couple of mini balls dropped in. In other words, I don't want to do it, and you can't do it because it's on federal property. And if you try to do it illegally and you get caught, you're no longer going to be a member of the faculty of the Department of History and UNC. So, and it's a felony, to dig on federal property without permission. So they're here, and I'm convinced that they are Confederate rifle pits. So that's number 7. Now we kind of lose them in here, but again, the ground is much more open. They're not as deep.
There's one here, but this road took it out.
So anyway, I think this is number 12. And they kind of disappear from here. Now, I don't know why. I don't know if they weren't built. I don't know if the elements got them. I just don't know. But we've got 12 that have survived.
Is this one right?
Yeah, that one too.
So they would sound the alarm, take a shot or 2, and then go back over.
Right, so they were stationed here, and the Federals would have had them too. They had their line, but they would have had sentinels or pickets out in front. They would exchange shots, but sometimes they would exchange coffee and tobacco and newspapers and swamp stories. They would fraternize with the enemy. That was not uncommon, but basically they were here as an early warning system that if there was a massive frontal assault underway, these guys could fire a shot to warn the troops in the rear what's coming, and then they would abandon this position and withdraw inside the main works. And that's exactly what happened on February the 11th. So if you can imagine, there were Confederate soldiers stationed in these rifle pits, and they were probably last occupied on February the 11th, 1865, and then abandoned, and those guys retreated into the main works if they weren't killed, wounded, or captured.
Did they dig
How
these
far up
before
is
weeks before, or did they?
Oh
come
yeah,
out?
they would have dug these at the time that the works were occupied.
So they weren't worried about being shot at when they were preparing these for later.
Right, right.
In the earlier part of the war, it would have just been a skirmish line, but by this time of the war, they entrenched all the time, so they dug foxholes.
Yeah, about 64.
Yeah.
It pretty much turned to
Yeah.
trench warfare, particularly in Virginia.
Yeah.
Down here in the Wilmington Campaign
Yeah,
too.
we're everywhere then by then, right?
Recognizing at some point there would be federal forces trying to come up.
Right. Remember that General Whiting in October '64 had gone to Fort Fisher, gotten Colonel Lamb. They rode up the peninsula on horseback because Whiting wanted to point out exactly where the federal troops would attempt to land in an attack. And by the fall of '64, Whiting had good intel that the attack was coming. And that's why he decided to build this line of works. Auxiliary works to support Fort Fisher, but also works to prevent federal forces from simply bypassing Fort Fisher and marching on Wilmington. So they would land on the sea beach, protected by the Sound, and then would have to march southward to establish a beachhead. And that's why these works were built north of where, well, the terminus of the Sound area was Carolina Beach, the lake. That's the closest body of fresh water to an ocean anywhere in the world. And that was the south terminus, or the south end of the Sound area. So that's all developed, that was been filled in and developed back in the early 20th century. So these lines were built north of that, so that the Federals couldn't simply go around the lake and march on Wilmington unopposed. Because what good was Fort Fisher if Wilmington was occupied? If they occupied the infrastructure, if they occupied the docks, if they now gained control of the Kaifia River and the railroads, what good was Fort Fisher? So that's why these works were built.